Okay, so that was the assassination of Lincoln, and let's try to get where we need to be. Okay, Reconstruction. All right, we remember that the South was the third richest in the country, or third richest in the world, after they're the poorest. The economy is ruined. The banks and businesses are all closed. There's runaway inflation. Just as an example, there's no infrastructure. The transportation system is awful. Once Columbia, South Carolina, that's where University of South Carolina is today, had 5 trains coming into it. Now the closest train to Columbia, South Carolina is 29 miles away. Y'all remember Sherman's March to the Sea. Bring the war home to the people, and they destroyed everything in the path. That is so that the Southern people wouldn't rise up again. Plantations, they aren't functioning. They are just harvesting weeds. The livestock have been driven off, many a times eaten by Yankee soldiers for survival purposes. So plantation owners who don't have slaves anymore, they'll hitch themselves to their own plows while their women and children steer. Kind of a different world for them now, obviously. It's not going to be until 1870s that the South will produce cotton levels. But you guys remember Egypt and India were now making cotton as well. So they're having some competition, and the prices won't be as lucrative for them. Plantation owners had lost about $2 billion in slave wealth, and their mansions many times were charred and gutted in Sherman's March to the Sea by Yankee soldiers. I do need to explain to you that Lincoln was reelected in the middle of the war. He ran against one of his own generals, McClellan, and McClellan is going to lose because of the Emancipation Proclamation, but Lincoln had chose a new VP, and his new VP was actually a Southerner. He was trying to show that he was going to be lenient on the South and for them to put their weapons down. The problem with Andrew Johnson, he's not even a Republican, he's a Democrat. He didn't secede with his home state of Tennessee like the other Southerners did, so he's kind of rewarded. But he is a Southerner. He grew up very poor, and he also is a staunch racist. So he will not be a good president, one of the worsts after Lincoln's death. There is Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. That was his first vice president. He replaces him with a Southerner who didn't secede. He's literally like the only senator from the South that stays in the Senate, and he's rewarded because Lincoln wants to show that he's going to be lenient on the South to try to get the South to stop the fighting sooner than they did. Okay, so you need to know that the Reconstruction period is 1865 to 1877. Those are important dates that you have to know, kind of like 1607 with Jamestown. The definition of Reconstruction is rebuilding and readmitting the defeated Confederate states. Remember, 2/3 of the wealth of the South is gone and destroyed. It's going to take them decades to recuperate. Restructuring Southern society, obviously, like what is going to be the fate of the former slave? What rights are they going to have? And the problem is there's no guidance. Who is to be in charge? And how is this supposed to happen? How are these Southern states supposed to get back into the fold, to get back into the Union? That's a big, big question. So there's 4 questions. How should the South be rebuilt? Remember, it is devastated by war, destruction. Most of the battles of the Civil War occurred in the South. And socially and economically, they have been devastated by the emancipation of the slaves and their whole way of life, their economy done. How should free slaves be treated? That's going to be a major issue between the Radical Reconstruction Congress, all Yankee Congress, and the president, who happens to be a Democratic Southerner and says he's going to be harsh, but he isn't. And he's going to pardon a bunch of them and be very, very belligerent in how those former slaves are going to be treated. How do southern states reenter? Like, how are they going to get back in and send representatives and senators to Congress? And who should be in charge? Should it be the president? Lincoln thought it would be him. He came up with his own plan. And then Congress doesn't like that a southerner and a Democratic person, Southern Democrat, is in the White House. And so they're going to try to steer Reconstruction and ultimately control Reconstruction. Okay. Anyway, Lincoln and Johnson's plan were one and the same. Lincoln had devised this plan before the war was over. He wanted it to be really easy. He wanted to be really lenient. So he was basically saying the 10% plan. And this was to try during the war to speed up the surrender. He wanted to pardon all the Confederate soldiers except for the leaders. And then once they got 10% of the population signing an oath of allegiance, then he would let the state back into the Union. And then they could send representatives and senators back to Congress. This is a really important quote. I would highlight this. This is in the quiz. With mouths toward none, with charity for all, let us strive to bind up the nation's wounds. And he backs this up with choosing a VP, a Democratic VP. Remember, he's a Republican. He's choosing Andrew Johnson as a vice presidential candidate with no expectation, obviously, that he's going to be assassinated, even though he had multiple assassination attempts. He would pardon anybody who would swear allegiance, and then as soon as the state got 10%, that's it, 10%, then they could send members to Congress. I mean, this is to entice the South to stop the fighting. It's his easiest plan as ever. And then, and this is kind of naive, he's hoping that the South will give blacks rights, the former slaves rights. But he's not going to make it mandatory, and he's surely not going to advertise any of that during the war because he wants them to stop the fighting. Arkansas and Louisiana, they had been occupied early in the war. They saw this as a plan, an easy way to get in. So they did all of this, and they are sending representatives to Congress. And Congress is refusing to seat them, refusing not to let them in. The Congress was elected during the war, so there are no Southerners in Congress. This is why we're calling it the Radical Reconstruction All-Yankee Congress. Northerners are angry, and they're angry about the war. They're angry. They know at least many of people that died in the war. They now are vengeful about Lincoln's assassination. So they're out to pay. They're out to make the South pay. They want to destroy the power of the slaveholders. And then they even talked about distributing 40 acres and a mule to all of the former slaves and take the acres from the big old fat plantation owners. So that was key. And there's still a debate today. Many of the Democratic candidates, I know we're down to, Biden and Sanders, but they advocate for, some kind of reparations for slavery. And that's where this comes from, because originally the Radical Reconstruction Congress was arguing that they should get 40 acres and a mule. They want Congress, not the president, obviously, to control Reconstruction. They don't trust a Southern Democratic president. Andrew Johnson is a drunk. He slurs his words. He's not really that good of a president. He's going to be one of the top worst. Anyway, Congress's plan. They want 50% signing oath of allegiance. And they want only male citizens who didn't participate in the Confederacy to vote. So who's that going to be? Only African-American males. I told you guys about that Free State of Jones. There was this community that wanted to secede from the South during the war because they realized that it was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. And so they actually made a movie. Matthew McConaughey's in Free State of Jones. Anyway, if this is the case under the Congress's plan, then only African-American men and very few white males will be able to vote. Remember, women aren't going to get the vote till way later on. 19th Amendment. Lincoln, before his death, did not like this plan, and he pocket vetoed it before his death, which means the bill died because it came to him. Congress didn't have 10 days, so the bill died, and it didn't even get a chance to get overridden. And so it died. Congress's plan died. So it's really, really up in the air who's going to decide this Reconstruction plan. And it's unrealistic to expect 50% because if that's the case, then that's kind of indicating that, then 50%, why would they have been seceded? So that's unrealistic. 10 is too easy, but 50% is unrealistic. If more than half of states' voters had seceded, then if more than half of the state's population didn't participate in the Confederacy, then the state would have never seceded, is what I'm trying to say. I'm very rusty at this. And you guys got to remember about the 3/5 clause. What about the 3/5 clause scares the North now that that's gone? That means that a slave's population, 100% of a slave's population is going to count. And if you don't get that former slave the power to vote, then what that means is that South is going to get more representatives in the House and maybe even outnumber the North, and the North is very nervous about that. So the 3/5 clause is gone now that slavery has been abolished during the Civil War. And they're getting the 13th Amendment ratified. Different views of how to let Southern states back into the Union. Lincoln believed that they never had seceded, and he's using this as an incentive by 1863, when it's clear that the South is going to lose. The Anaconda effect is taking hold. There is no way the British and the French are going to help the South. It's just a matter of time. And so Lincoln is using this as an incentive to get them to put down their weapons. And so Congress believes that they had seceded, and there's 600,000 people dead as proof of their secession, and obviously wants them to pay. And therefore, they need to act like new territories seeking readmission and make it as difficult as possible so that we never have another Civil War again, okay? With Lincoln dead, Andrew Johnson is going to be sworn in. Lincoln dies the very next day. He was the only Confederate who remained loyal to the Civil War, but he is still a states' rights Southern Democrat. It appeared like he hated slave owners, but it was almost like a wannabe thing. He emulated them, that wannabe thing that the slave plantation owners held over the poor Southern white dudes. On the ticket with Lincoln to win the border states in the re-election, because the Emancipation Proclamation ticked off the border states, and McClellan was talking about, and he was the other candidate in that election, he was talking about letting the South go. So the border states, they might go with McClellan in all of this. So Congress is in recess when Lincoln is sworn in. So Johnson is just going to continue Lincoln's plan. And Alabama, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, they're all going to try to get in under this plan. It's a very easy plan, the 10% plan. The only thing they have to do is ratify the 13th Amendment. And that will make that Emancipation Proclamation war document permanent, abolishing slavery, obviously. And obviously this would be reversing what part of Dred Scott? The part that basically says slaves were pieces of what? Property. Well, that is no longer. Their citizenship is a whole nother thing. But Johnson is no supporter of the former slave. He is a white supremacist. He's probably the most racist president we've ever had in the White House. And he is a staunch supporter of states' rights and really wants to make it as lenient for the South to get back into the Union. He promises to punish the traitors, but then he hands out 13,000 pardons. This is the largest number of pardons ever. Any other wartime pardons in history? I'd be asking you this in class. You can hit me up on Remind if you know the answer to that. Anyway, by 1865, newly elected Southerners were coming to take their seats under Johnson's plan because Congress was adjourned during this period of time. 58 Confederate congressmen came in, 6 Confederate cabinet members, the vice president of the Confederacy, and 4 Confederate generals. And Congress is like, no, we are not seating these dudes. And Johnson had pardoned them all, and that's his power as president, but Congress is refusing to seat them. So there's definitely now a battle between the executive and the legislative. It becomes crystal clear to the radical Reconstruction, all Yankee Congress, out the gate that the South is not going to treat these former slaves decently at all. Everything about the black codes that got started in Mississippi and South Carolina was restricting their every move, restricting their everyday way of life, and literally re-enslaving them without the name of slavery. And so once they started in Mississippi and South Carolina, and by the way, those were the two states that had the largest population of former slaves, they spread like wildfire to all the other states. They're making state laws that they can't serve on juries. They're making laws they can't testify against whites. They're making laws they can't marry whites. They can't start their own business. What does this mean economically? This means that they're not going to have any way of living. They can't travel without a permit. Why are they all traveling, by the way? They're traveling because they're trying to find their loved ones. A quarter to half of all slave families were broken up with slave sales, and family members just shipped off all over, and so they're wandering to try to find their loved ones. Well, now they're being told they can't travel without a permit. They can't rent. They can't lease farmland. They of course can't own farmland. They can't even make eye contact. They have to step off of a path that is in the same way as a white is coming. I mean, this is just ridiculous. And they couldn't go to schools. They had to obey curfews. And so then this is when the KKK was formed, the Ku Klux Klan. And whites will form it to use violence to keep these black codes obeyed. In Florida, they had a vagrancy law. Vagrancy is wandering from place to place without a permit. You could be fined, and if you couldn't pay the fine, which how are you going to pay a fine if you can't, make a living? Then they're going to sell your services out to the highest bidder. So all until they're trying to re-enslave you without the name slavery. So these black codes are just awful, and these are just some of the primary sources. This is from the Black Codes of Mississippi. Shall not be lawful for any freedman, free Negro, or mulatto to intermarry with any white person, or any white person to intermarry with any freedman or free Negro. And this is a felony, and you could go to jail for life. This says life. And so those descendants from a Negro to the third generation are considered African American too, and fall under these Black Code rules as well. And so obviously these are pretty harsh. These are just some additional ones. And again, what they're trying to do is re-enslave them without the name slavery. And so Congress is just outraged. And they are making a reaction to the Black Codes. They're trying to do everything they can to try to halt the Black Codes. And by this, they know they're going to have to take over Reconstruction, that Johnson is actually going to, curtail any efforts at trying to give the former slaves some rights. And so they made the Freedmen's Bureau to try to assist the former slaves by providing schools and food and blankets and supplies and such. And Johnson obviously shows his true colors here. He vetoes it. Congress is just stunned. The Freedmen's Bureau of 1866 was to assist the former slaves. It set up like 40 hospitals, 4,000 schools, 74 teacher training centers. And this is where you're going to have a ton of whites from the North come on down and try to help with establishing training centers and helping with hospitals and schools and such. And they're going to be nicknamed by the Southerners carpetbaggers. Okay, and at the time there was this popular bag that kind of looked like an Oriental rug, and that's why they were called carpetbaggers. The result is, by 1869, 600,000 blacks were in school, but they risked their lives going to school because whites are going to threaten them, and they're going to use the KKK to try to shut these schools down and such. And the teachers are going to be harassed, so it's no easy path to try to get into school. Anyway, Congress at this point is realizing it's got to do something, so it's still an all-Yankee, radical Republican Congress. It doesn't have any Southerners in it, because remember, it refused to seat them. So it passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and it's going to give former slaves black citizenship. This is a future 14th Amendment, and it's going to forbid the states from passing these black codes. It's going to make it illegal. Johnson vetoed it again, but they were having the ability to override him. And he is going to have the most overrides in American history. Now, this Civil Rights Act and future 14th Amendment what part of the Dred Scott case is it reversing? It's basically granting former slaves citizenship, and then with citizenship means you get all the rights and protections of any other American citizen. And that's really, really important. And so two major facets of that Dred Scott case now have been reversed: the property stuff, and then the fact that they aren't citizens. Now they are. Anyone born on U.S. soil, according to the 14th Amendment, is a citizen. Congress is going to refuse to accept the state governments admitted under Johnson's plan, and that's when they're going to issue the beginnings of the 14th Amendment. An amendment starts in Congress. It has to get 2/3 of a vote of Congress. That's easy to do because it's all Yankees, it's all Republican Congress at this point. No southern states are back in the fold yet. And so then they send it off to the states. Well, they can easily get the states to ratify it. They need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. But the South, of course, isn't going to ratify it. So they're going to make this a condition upon them getting back into the Union once they're in the driver's seat of Reconstruction. And basically, if they deny African Americans their citizenship rights, they could lose representation and seats in Congress. That's what the 14th Amendment says. So this is a really important concept. We have incorporation now. What this 14th Amendment does and why it's more important than any of the other amendments is it takes the Bill of Rights and applies it on down to the state level. Prior to the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights only applied to the national government. And now the states and local governments have to obey the Bill of Rights as well. And literally you'll start to see on a case-by-case basis the Bill of Rights applicable to the local and state governments. The Confederate leaders are not going to be allowed to hold office. Congress just won't let them in, like Johnson was letting them in. And so two important leaders of this Radical Reconstruction Congress, Thaddeus Stevens, this is him here, this is Thaddeus Stevens right here, he's in charge of the House, and he really wants to punish the slave owners. He actually was in the North, living in the North, and he was involved with his housekeeper. She was a light-skinned African-American woman, and they were not allowed to marry. And so he wanted to be buried with her, and he knew she couldn't be buried in a white cemetery, so he was going to be buried in a black cemetery with her to advocate in death what he preached in life. And then here is Charles Sumner. You guys remember him. He has finally recovered from his Senate beating by Preston Brooks. He's still suffering major PTSD and such. But these are the two leaders of one of the most powerful Congresses in American history. And they want to make it an issue of the midterm elections, who's to control Reconstruction. And so basically they're going to be trying to campaign for a larger percentage of Republicans. They already have a large percentage, but Johnson is actually going to take a tour of the northern cities to literally try and get support for his plan. He's not very popular, obviously, if he's a Southern Democrat right after the Civil War. And he is honestly going to take this swing around the circle tour, and it's a major embarrassment for him. He gave speeches where he compared himself to Jesus because he had 13,000 Southern pardons, and he said, like Jesus forgave people for their sins. That didn't go over too well. And then he compared Congress to Judas, because y'all know Judas was Jesus' betrayer. And then when hecklers would yell at him in the middle of the crowd, he would heckle back. He had such a horrible temper, and he also drank. He drank a lot. He was visiting Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and at a train stop, and the platform had too many people on it, and the platform collapsed. Now, he never was in danger at all, but they wanted to get him out of the way so that rescue crews could go help the people who had fallen to their death 20 feet below. But he's seen leaving the scene on his train as unsympathetic and such, so it really didn't. He looked awful for leaving. Anyway, the victories for the Radical Reconstruction Congress over the president gave them a huge veto-proof Congress. And so now anything Congress wants to do, they can do, and they are totally in the driver's seat. They will be in charge after these midterm elections. And so I'm going to stop here. because I need to take a break, and then I'll just create a second part 2 video. But Congress is definitely in charge.